Okay, Data for Good Saskatchewan community, welcome to our December 5th talk, final talk of 2024. We really appreciate you all coming out today. Um, just for you, because it's Christmas time, we got an extra special guest with us today. Nick Desbarats has a hard to pronounce name, but he's an awesome guy. So I'm going to get started by just plugging Data for Good a little bit, talking a bit more about what we do if you don't know. And then we'll get into our talk. So you guys can, yeah, hear Nick talk about the 9 different types of dashboarding and how to deliver with your dashboards and charts. So let me just share my screen. I hope I got the right one here. Give me 1 second, folks. Okay. So we'll talk more about Nick in a second, but before we get started, as we usually do, I know we usually have a mix of new members, we have a mix of nonprofits and other community groups, as well as our longtime data analyst folks. So just want to give a plug to Data for Good Saskatchewan for who we are and what we do. So we are a group of data and AI enthusiasts, a community, and what we do is we try to build our data and analytics community through giving back to our larger community. Our mission is really to help nonprofits by running a number of different kinds of projects and programs, all with a data analytics and AI bent, to help those nonprofits realize improvements and improve their ability to serve their stakeholders. If you want to know more about us, saskatchewan.dataforgood.ca. We've also got up in the corner there, I have a little QR code so you can log in there. For those of you who are interested in registering for projects, typically we go to that list first. If we have a form that you can fill out there, and we will go to that list first as we put projects out. So please make sure that even if you're on the meetup, even if you're on the LinkedIn, that you get onto that, you get into our form there, so that you're able to realize, get notified when we have projects upcoming. Okay. Just to highlight a bit of the work we've done. And Ross, could you mute? I think there's just might be some back talk from one of our guests. If you could just see if they could mute themselves. And if you are on, please mute yourself, just so that we don't have any feedback or anything. But past projects that we have done work with Sexual Assault Services Saskatchewan, helping them build their data center that you can view on their website. We've worked with the Regina Public Library on projects helping them identify where their service areas are. Sask Rugby. We've done an awesome project with the Regina Food Bank, helping them find a place for their new location in town here in Regina. And of course, our data accelerator program, training nonprofits and building out dashboarding reporting for them, while also helping you folks get your experience in a controlled class accelerator type format. And Nick, I know you wanted to hear more about what we did, so there you go. Our leadership, we've got a number of folks. You can find us all on the website. So myself, I'm one of the co-leads of Data for Good, as well as Scott Wells over here, the other chapter co-lead. And then we've got Ross here today with us doing our co-pilot duties here, keeping an eye on the chat and everything like that, and the rest of our leadership team. And just before we get started, and just to shout out, I'll mention this probably at the beginning or at the end as well, just because we want to make sure we're getting you folks engaged. This is the holiday season, so we are going to be taking a little bit of a break here. But in the new year, we've got a lot of fun things coming up. We plan to run our Data Accelerator program again starting in February or March, running till May. So keep an eye out for that. We're looking at other avenues to kind of grow the message of that one, so you might see some more stuff coming. We have a couple projects kicking off with the Saskatoon Food Bank and Learning Center, as well as for Saskatoon Trades and Skills. We put a call out for that last week to our members. So yeah, so if you're on there, if you haven't heard back yet, it's really just we have to find the time to go through all of the applications. There's a lot of interest in getting involved, and we really thank you for that. But it does take a bit of work on our part to run these things and vet the resumes and things, or not resumes, but vet everybody who's applied. We're looking for speakers. If you guys know of any good speakers who might want to come forward and speak at Data for Good Saskatchewan, we are working on lining a few things up into the new year, but we're always looking for folks who might have, interesting perspectives that they could bring to our nonprofit partners, bring to our data analysts, or even just the larger community that comes to these things. And last but not least, we're also doing a look at our strategy and working on structure a little bit more. We're finding that, because of all the exciting things we've got going on, like I think we have 5 projects in the hopper that we haven't announced yet that we're kind of working on. And we've got all kinds of programs we're looking to run. We're just really starting to expand a lot quicker than we really ever anticipated. So we are looking at structure and just looking at, different roles that we can bring on to kind of help out with running this whole big ship. So you probably will hear more about that in the future, but just know that right now we're looking at that and looking at opportunities for where we can get folks more engaged to help us out with more than just the projects, but also, running this thing. So. And then last but not least, we have a QR code here for saskatchewan.dataforgood.com. So feel free to jump in there and sign up if you're interested in pursuing a project with us, or follow us on LinkedIn because you'll be kept up to date there as well. As well as we have the meetup, but you can find those through our LinkedIn as well. Okay. All right. And you know what? There'll be time for questions at the end, so don't worry about jumping in. So if you have questions about the talk today or questions about anything that I've talked about, we'll definitely save some time at the end to talk about that. But to kick this off, just want to introduce our awesome speaker, Nick Desbarats. So as an independent educator and best-selling author, Nick Desbarats has taught data visualization and information dashboard design to thousands of professionals in over a dozen countries at organizations such as NASA, Bloomberg, Visa, the United Nations, and Shopify. Nick is the author of the Amazon #1 new release, Practical Charts, in 2023, and has lectured at Yale, the University of Toronto, and the University of Victoria, University of Wellington in New Zealand. Nick's going to be talking to us a lot about some of his really cool work putting together dashboards. I think we heard about the 9 different types of dashboarding, but without further ado, I'll let Nick take it away. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Ryan. And I'm really, delighted to be talking to the group. I am familiar with Data for Good. There's a chapter in Ottawa where I'm based as well that does fantastic work. So yeah, good on you guys. Let me share my screen here. Oh,
you're a co-host now, so you should be able to. Sorry, I
okay.
just realized you had to make you one.
No worries. So let me share that screen. There we go. You're seeing my screen with the happy user. All right. So yeah, this is kind of the unfortunate reality out there, right? Normally I like to start off my talks with something like sort of uplifting or inspiring, but for you guys, I'm going to keep it real, which is that this is kind of what's out there, right? This is the unfortunate reality that most of us face, that the user satisfaction rates around dashboards are typically pretty low, and the abandonment rates tend to be pretty high. A lot of dead dashboards out there where you created something that the client asked for, or your internal users, whoever you're making dashboards for, and it seemed to be exactly what they had requested, but then you check the analytics 3 months later or whatever, and nobody's using it, or people are checking in like once in a blue moon. And so, this is unfortunately kind of an eerily sort of consistent, similar situation in virtually all the organizations that I work with, right? On the one hand, you have users who are not happy. They're complaining that dashboards have too much information on them, or kind of the opposite, right? Not enough information on them. There's actually information that I need in order to do my job, and it's missing, or it's too hard to find. It's, I can't remember what tab it was on or how to filter or whatever. And sometimes they think the problem is just that the dashboard doesn't look cool enough, right? They think, oh, if the dashboard basically looked prettier, it would be more useful to me. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then on the other side, you have dashboard designers and developers like yourselves who are also not happy. They're complaining that users ask for ridiculous amounts of information to be on the dashboard, but make sure it all fits on one screen because I'm going to take screenshots of it and print it and distribute it at the monthly management meeting. And all my users seem to want different things on the dashboard. When I try and do requirements gathering, they're coming up with all sorts of different stuff. And even you'll sometimes have the same people asking for different stuff at different times, right? One week they're asking for this, and then the next week it's all different. They call everything a dashboard. If it's a display, it's got a bunch of charts on it. That's what they call it, even though what they really might need is actually something more like just like a report or an email or something. And so, yeah, not a really sort of great state of affairs when it comes to dashboards right now. Obviously, the big business intelligence software companies like Microsoft and Tableau and all the others aren't going to tell you this, but this is the unfortunate reality: is that the graveyard of abandoned dashboards is well populated, right? And so when this happens, when people create dashboards that they thought were, really what people needed, what the audience needed, but they're, just not getting used, or people are just not very happy with them, then, oftentimes people start kind of reaching out, like trying to do research and start asking kind of, dashboard design best practice questions. Like, for example, is it okay to put filters on a dashboard, right? Filters have kind of pros and cons. Obviously, you can kind of drill down with filters, but they also potentially hide information. Or does everything need to fit on one screen? Or can I have like maybe tabs across the top? Or is it okay if there's information that's kind of below the fold? Like, is that okay? Or should the visual design of dashboards be kind of more visually kind of graphic designy, more eye-catching, or more kind of conservative and subdued? Like, what's the best practice there? Or should dashboards serve one role, like, where we have the CEO dashboard, which is different than the CFO dashboard? Or should we have these kind of multi-role dashboards where you have like a management dashboard that is designed to be used by multiple different roles, right? Like, what's the best practice there? Now, if you've ever actually kind of really researched these questions, you will find that the answers differ depending on who you listen to, right? Depending on which experts, which books or articles you're reading, you'll actually get different answers to all of these questions. So it's kind of a bit of a mess. But don't worry, it actually does get worse, because people don't even agree on this, right? When we ask, people who are knowledgeable about dashboards, like what should dashboards do, you get all sorts of different answers, right? Some people will say, oh, a dashboard should provide an at-a-glance view of current status, or a dashboard should answer a question, or a dashboard should prompt the user to take action, or a dashboard should tell a story, or a dashboard should provide all the information that a given user needs to do their job, or allow users to drill down and analyze data, improve organizational performance. It's like, which one is it? Right? It's not like we can design dashboards around all of these very different kinds of objectives. But don't worry, it actually gets even worse, because people don't even agree on what this word even means, right? Depending on who you talk to, depending on who you listen to, you'll get different definitions of what is a dashboard or not a dashboard. Is there any good news here? Yes, there is. Happily, if you were to take essentially like 1,000 random people, let's say, and 1,000 random organizations, and show them a bunch of different kinds of information displays and get them to point to the ones that they would call dashboards, you'd actually probably find a pretty consistent definition emerging, which is basically that a dashboard is any display with a bunch of charts on it. Right. To most people, that's what a dashboard is. It's a display, or like a screen or a page, even a poster in certain cases. It's got a bunch of charts on it. That's a dashboard, for better or for worse. And so, it's kind of this very broad term, essentially. And so it's kind of analogous, or kind of similar to a term like document, right? In the way that we use document in kind of common conversation, a document is any page or pages with words and or images on them. And so again, kind of one of these broad umbrella terms. And so it's going to include all sorts of things, right? Restaurant menus, national constitutions, haiku poetry, photographs. These are all documents. And that's why we don't really talk about document writing best practices, right? It doesn't really make any sense, because the way that the best practices for writing mystery novels have nothing to do with the best practices for writing, I don't know, patent applications or something, right? And instead we talk about best practices for writing different types of documents. And so now we would come back to dashboard. Well, if a dashboard is similarly kind of broad like this, it's also going to be this broad umbrella term for lots of different things. Like, for example, this dashboard, as the designers called it, which is basically a filtering interface, right? There's a large data set behind this, and then as you select filters along the side, it then filters that data down. Or this dashboard, as the United Nations called it, which is basically kind of a snapshot of the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. Uh, it will probably never be updated. It's kind of a static thing, probably targeted at a very large audience, right? An audience potentially of millions of people. And then we have your typical kind of executive sort of KPI dashboard, which might be just targeted at a single individual, right? This might just be for the CEO or for the VP of marketing or whatever. Or this dashboard, again, as the designers called it, which is basically kind of this what if sort of interactive simulator where you can change the minimum wage, and then depending on what the government decides it is, this will all update, right? So we can see how different levels of minimum wage would impact different areas of our business. Again, the people who created this called it a dashboard. This one tells me how my workout is going. This one tells me how fast I'm going. And so we have this essentially very wide variety of different types of data products that show different kinds of data to different kinds of audiences, and that serve very different purposes. And so, if we want to talk about dashboard design best practices or answer some of those questions, which we were asking before, like, does everything need to fit on one screen? Or, are filters okay? What are the chances that the answers to those questions are going to be the same for all of these kinds of different information displays? Probably zero, right? And so instead, it would probably make much more sense to talk about design best practices for different types of dashboards. But the problem is we don't have any, right? We just have this one term, dashboard, that we use to describe all of these very different kinds of data products. And so I think that this is really kind of one of the major reasons why dashboards just haven't been going very well since the dawn of dashboards, right? I mean, they were called different things in different periods of time. Like in the 80s, they were called executive information systems, and they've been through a bunch of buzzword iterations. But it's clearly not working very well, right? And so my argument is that we need a different approach. One might even say that we need a reboot. I don't know if anybody's seen this series. It's a British sitcom called The IT Crowd, and it's hilarious if you haven't watched it. But one of the catchphrases of one of the main characters who works for an IT department is, "Hello, IT, have you tried turning it off and on again?" being the kind of the default response to every inquiry. And I think that's kind of what we need. We need a different approach to dashboards, right? If we want a different result, if we want better user satisfaction, more traction, we need to do things differently. And I think that basically starts here, right? We have to start talking about not just like things like dashboard design best practices, but best practices for designing different types of dashboards. And so when I started thinking about this a number of years ago, I was wondering, as you might be wondering right now, like, aren't there like thousands of different kinds of displays with a bunch of charts on them? And after looking at many, many different dashboards and many different organizations, I found that actually, no, there were about eight. There are about eight types of dashboards. And so that's actually pretty manageable, right? And so I basically started organizing them into categories, sort of a classification or taxonomy system of dashboards. And at the highest level, there are two categories. The first are what I call live data dashboards, which, as you can imagine, describe data or dashboards that are based on dynamically or live data, right? It might be updating every 10 seconds or once a month, but it's based on data that changes over time. And then we have what I call static data dashboards, which are basically dashboards that are crafted around a sort of a static snapshot of data that's never going to be updated. And right away, you start to see differences. Like, for example, on live data dashboards, these are your operations dashboards, your finance dashboards, your marketing dashboards, that kind of thing, basically for enabling employees, customers, stakeholders to interact with an organization's data. And these tend to have a kind of more subtle, subdued visual design, more conservative. Not a lot of storytelling for these because it's usually not possible, right? The dashboard looks different every time the user looks at it. So it's kind of up to them to figure out what the story is on any given day or week or month. These tend to be fairly interactive, sometimes with even kind of fairly complex interactivity. And the primary purpose of these is to answer data related questions. And so these can be questions that are very specific. How many widgets did we sell in Germany in Q3 of last year? Or very broad, like, is everything okay, for example? And then when it comes to the static data dashboards, we'll start to see some real differences, right? So these are used both inside and outside of organizations. You'll see these sometimes in public awareness campaigns, marketing campaigns. A lot of people will call these actually infographics or interactives, for example. These tend to have, and in my opinion, probably should have a more kind of eye-catching creative visual design. You want a graphic designer involved here, usually storytelling with these because you can, right? This is a static snapshot of data that doesn't change over time, and so you can actually tell a story around it. Generally, not a lot of interactivity with these. Maybe some simple filtering, but that's about it, or none at all. And the primary purpose of these is to cause some kind of desired change in the mind of the audience. And so we're typically trying to persuade them of something, or we're trying to explain something to them, or just raise their awareness of something. And so kind of different than answering data related questions. And so within each of these two categories, right, these live data and static data categories, there are the 8 types that I mentioned before. And so I'm going to kind of go through these very briefly. This is actually from a 2-day course, which I offer, but I'm just going to give you the kind of the whirlwind tour because we don't have 2 days. Starting with this high level category that I call tactical monitoring dashboards. And there are kind of 3 subtypes within these. But at a high level, these tactical monitoring dashboards are for answering 2 questions, right? The first is everything okay? And this is actually an incredibly important question because very often people kind of struggle with dashboards because they're always saying, well, my audience, they don't tell me what kind of questions they want answered. But I can tell you from experience that at least 75% of the time, this is the question they're trying to answer, right? Something bad has happened in the organization in the past, and they want to, but they didn't notice, right? Nobody noticed the problem until it got so bad that it blew up. And so then they're like, well, I don't want that to happen again. And so I need a dashboard that's actually going to show me essentially if everything is going okay, or if anything requires my attention, which is the second question, right? And if so, of course, what is it that requires my attention? And so these are, like I said, incredibly important questions. They're also incredibly difficult to answer, right? Because when you think about it, like, is everything okay? Well, everything can mean like a lot of things, even in a relatively small organization. Once we start looking at all the metrics that we might care about and we start segmenting them by project or by region or business unit or whatever, you end up with a lot of numbers. And unfortunately, most dashboards actually don't do this very effectively, right? This is a typical kind of CEO sort of executive dashboard. And, so can we answer these questions, right? Is everything okay? Does anything require my attention? Who knows, right? And unfortunately, this is actually a really common problem with dashboards is that they make what I call the deadly assumption, which is that our users have detailed background knowledge about all the numbers on the dashboard, and they can somehow figure out if these numbers are good or bad and what requires attention. Is that a safe assumption, though? Virtually never, right? And so, but I'd say 80 to 90% of the dashboards that I see are like this. There's no indication essentially about whether these are good or bad numbers, which ones require attention. Some dashboards do have indicators. Probably the most common type is change versus previous period, right? So this is a kind of a daily dashboard, and it's showing the current values compared to the previous day's values, right? Pretty common. You've probably seen dashboards like this before. But are we any better off, right? What requires attention here? Well, apparently everything, right? all the time because unless a value it just happens to be exactly the same as its previous day or previous month or whatever, it's going to get flagged. And so I actually have a very technical term for this. I call this Christmas tree syndrome because our dashboard is lit up red and green, but it's 365 days a year. And it's just not very helpful. It's not very useful, right? Flagging everything is pretty much the same as flagging nothing. Another common way of at least trying to show kind of, what requires attention is to show deviation from target, right? So we set target values for each of our numbers and we show whether it's above or below target. But again, what requires attention? Well, once again, apparently everything all the time, flagging everything is the same as flagging nothing. And so this is actually not a very effective way of showing it requires attention. And you might say, well, if something has like a very large deviation from target, that implies that it requires more attention. Maybe yes, maybe no. It could be that it's just a very volatile metric, right? It bounces around a lot over time, but maybe it actually doesn't require attention. And so even though these are very common indicators, they're actually not that useful because, like I said, they kind of flag everything all the time. And so a dashboard like this is, I think, a lot more useful, right? Is everything okay? Well, most things are okay. Does anything require my attention? Yep. Bang, immediately, right? This is what requires my attention the most. And then, once that's kind of under control, I should probably look at this and then I should look at this. And so finally, we're actually not flagging everything all the time. We're only flagging metrics that require attention, which I'm sure is begging the obvious question in your mind of like, okay, well, how exactly did we do this, right? How did we determine what requires attention and what doesn't? And it would take me a number of hours to explain it, right? There's actually quite a bit of complexity behind here. There's some statistics where we look for patterns that indicate that, a metric requires attention. But the idea is essentially to build enough intelligence into the dashboard so that it can actually do this, so that the user doesn't have to, right? Because otherwise the user has to figure out how are we doing, what requires attention, and most people just don't have time to do that, and so then they just don't use the dashboard essentially. And so finally, we've actually kind of defeated the Christmas tree, right? It's not a standard approach. I know a lot of you are looking at this going, "Wow, that doesn't look like any dashboard that I've seen before." But if we want a different result, if we want better user attraction, then we need to do things differently. Oops, sorry. Now, so this is a CEO dashboard, of course, and it has various sections on it, like sales and marketing and IT and operations, and all of the areas that, in this case, the CEO is responsible for. But you might have noticed that there's actually a relatively small amount of information about each section, right? In operations, there's only these 5 metrics, for example, because I can't put everything about operations on the CEO dashboard. There's no way that it would fit. But wouldn't it be cool if on the dashboard you could do this? Say, I need to know more about operations, click. And now I've actually got an entire dashboard about operations. So all of this now is about operations. And it looks like we have a problem in the manufacturing area here, right? And so, but I'm only looking at this relatively small amount of information about manufacturing, but clearly we have a problem with defect rates in our manufacturing. Wouldn't it be cool? I could click on defect rate. So then I go to another dashboard, which contains defect rate, but it's defect rate broken down by everything, right? By product model that we manufacture, by the plants that manufacture it. And so I can actually see specifically exactly where problems are occurring. The CEO may or may not ever want to drill down to this level, but if we take a very different approach to it, then all of a sudden this actually becomes considerably more useful to users. I'm giving you, like I said, a whirlwind tour. I talk about this in much more detail in my course, but just to give an idea that there is an alternative out there. And so I just showed you actually 3 different types of dashboards, right? So that first dashboard that we saw, a CEO dashboard, is an example of what I call a role dashboard. And so this is a dashboard for a single role, of course, like the CEO or account representative or regional manager or something like that. And then we went to the operations dashboard, which is an example of what I call an area dashboard, which is a dashboard about an area of the organization, like operations or marketing or finance, or the Saskatchewan, if we're looking at geographical areas. And then we went to the units manufactured dashboard. And that's an example of what I call an entity dashboard, where it's a whole dashboard about a single type of thing. Like in this case, our units manufactured. And so you might have dashboards like this about our customers or our transactions, things like that. Users don't have to understand any of this, but we as dashboard designers, I think, need to recognize that there are these different types of tactical monitoring dashboards. Of course, in a typical organization, there are lots of different roles, lots of different areas, lots of different entities, which is why eventually you would end up with something like this, right? Where you basically have kind of a network where people can navigate from one dashboard to another by clicking on things that actually interest them. Looks kind of complicated from our perspective, but from the user's perspective, this basically feels like a website. And so it's quite a different paradigm that I'm proposing, but basically that we start building dashboards like websites because people already know how websites work, like a news website like this, for example. So when we start, we have kind of this curated selection of information. It's not everything, it's not all the news, right? Because then the page would be, miles long. But if we want more information about a particular area, like like technology or politics, we just click on those things, and we get a whole page about those topics. Just like clicking on manufacturing brings us to a whole page about manufacturing. And then clicking on an individual story would be like clicking on an individual metric on a dashboard, right? And so we get then a whole page about that story or a whole page about that metric. And so we don't actually have to educate people or train them on how to do this. They've been doing this for decades, essentially. We're just adopting a paradigm that already exists. So like I said, that's kind of the whirlwind tour of tactical monitoring dashboards. I probably spend 70% of the time in my 2-day course just talking about these because they are so important and they're not easy to pull off. But the complexity that we take on is basically complexity that our users don't have to deal with. The other types of dashboards in my taxonomy here are strategic performance dashboards. And so these are basically dashboards with a very small number, typically fewer than 15 KPIs, right? And so this is kind of the first time I've actually said that kind of magic term KPI, because when we're talking about tactical monitoring, I just talk about metrics, right? Because they're not key metrics. But when we're talking about strategic performance, you want to focus on a very small number of carefully chosen KPIs. And so this is something that would be typically used during like an infrequent, like a monthly or quarterly organizational performance discussion, typically where the management team gets together and they ask questions like, are we achieving our strategic goals? What should we change so that we perform better in the future? And these are the kinds of questions that are best answered by one of these strategic performance dashboards. And so it looks kind of different than a tactical monitoring dashboard. And there are good reasons for that, which I'll go over in a moment. This is basically kind of a quick overview of all the KPIs that we chose carefully anyways, with brief comments about each. And it's primarily used as kind of an agenda for that monthly or quarterly strategic discussion by the management team. And so you have commentary here like, why is this KPI behaving as it is? And maybe even some recommendations about how we can kind of respond to it in the future. So it's more of a handcrafted thing than a dynamically generated thing, which is fine because these only need to be updated typically once a month or once a quarter, sometimes even just like semi-annually. And so people sometimes get a little bit sort of confused about the difference between tactical monitoring dashboards and strategic performance dashboards. And so I wanted to kind of contrast these a bit because, to be honest, when I separated these things in my own mind a few years ago, a lot of things became a lot simpler. And so these two types of dashboards just serve fundamentally different purposes, right? So a tactical monitoring dashboard is about trouble spotting, situational awareness. And so when somebody is using a dashboard like this, they're in a very reactive mode. Essentially, if everything is okay, they don't do anything. But with strategic performance dashboards, they're in a more proactive mode, right? And so they're actually thinking like, how can we do things differently or better in the future to improve our performance as an organization? Tactical monitoring dashboards tend to be looked at a high frequency. Sometimes these are even real time, like in a data center or a hospital emergency ward or something, where they're updated every few seconds. Whereas strategic performance dashboards tend to be low frequency. They're looked at, once a month, once a quarter, maybe even, twice a year. On a tactical monitoring dashboard, you're going to have many thousands of metrics. Like once you start clicking into the tree, the hierarchies of metrics, there's going to be a whole lot of them. Whereas on a strategic performance dashboard, fewer than 20. Basically, the number of KPIs that we can talk about in a strategic planning meeting, which is even 20 would be a lot, like 15 probably more realistic number. These tactical monitoring dashboards tend to have a very narrow scope, right? It's about a single area, a single role, a single entity, whereas strategic performance dashboards are about the whole team, the whole organization, so much, much wider scope. And the way that we decide what goes on a tactical monitoring dashboard is very different, right, than a strategic performance dashboard. Like pretty much any metric that we might need to actually do something about is going to go on a tactical monitoring dashboard, whereas a strategic performance dashboard is going to have fewer than 15 numbers on it. So a much, much smaller set of metrics. And so I tend to think of tactical monitoring dashboards as kind of like sonar displays. We're kind of scanning the huge ocean of metrics out there, and we're looking for blips, right? Is there anything out there that I need to deal with? Whereas strategic performance dashboards, I tend to think of like kind of like report cards. They don't come out very often. They don't have much information on them. Some scores and then some recommendations maybe about how to perform better in the future. And so these are very, very different kinds of information products. And yet, unfortunately, most organizations don't recognize this, and they try to use the same dashboard for these two very different use cases. And this just doesn't work well. This is what I call a Swiss Army knife dashboard because we're basically trying to cram too many capabilities, too many tools into a single tool. And what you end up with is something that basically does nothing well. So that's strategic performance dashboards. And then we have canned analysis dashboards. And so these are basically like little kind of mini applications that automate the answers to potentially complex questions that people ask us all the time. And so this is kind of self-serve analytics, right? Where we keep on getting asked the same question over and over again. And instead of doing a custom analysis every time, we build a tool to basically automate the answer. And so we can then hand that over to kind of non-data people, and then they can get their own answers whenever they want without basically bothering the data team every time. So we actually saw an example of these a little bit, at the beginning of my presentation, right? This kind of what if simulator where we can change the minimum wage and it's going to show us how it'll impact our business. And so whenever people want, they can say, well, what would happen if it were $14? What would happen if it were $17? And they can get their answer without actually bothering the data team every time. So that's it for kind of the live data dashboards. And then we have that second kind of high level category of dashboards, which are static data dashboards. And so there's three types of those. The first are what I call persuasion dashboards, which, as you can probably imagine, are dashboards for persuading the target audience to adopt a particular point of view, take a certain action, choose a given alternative. And so we're going to evaluate these based on the degree to which the audience does what we were trying to persuade them to do, right? And so an example of a persuasion dashboard, I know a lot of us wouldn't call this a dashboard, but a lot of people would call this a dashboard, is this, which is basically trying to make the case for more parental leave in the US. And so there's some data about other countries, for example, but this is a static thing. It'll probably never be updated. And so it's not a live data dashboard, it's a static data dashboard. Then we have the second type of static data dashboards, which I call explanation dashboards. And so these are for increasing a target audience's comprehension or familiarity with a concept or process and organization. And so we're going to evaluate these based on the degree to which our target audience improves their understanding of whatever it is that we are trying to explain to them. And so we also saw an example of one of these a little bit earlier on as well. This is that dashboard from the UN about the refugee crisis. And so it's just explaining something to us. It's not trying to persuade us of anything, at least not in any obvious way. And it's static data, right? It may or may not ever be updated in the future. And then we have the third and final type of static data dashboards, which are what I call engagement dashboards. And so these are primarily for generating awareness and interest in a data set for among as many people as possible. And so when we're evaluating the effectiveness of these, we're typically looking at how many views or clicks or likes or shares or all those wonderful and horrible things that a given dashboard is getting. We're basically trying to get attention. And so this would be an example of what I would call an engagement dashboard. So this is actually something that I pulled out of a potentially really dull, boring article about mortality statistics. But they made this little kind of interactive thing where you can put in your gender, ethnicity, your age, and I guess it'll tell you how you're going to die, right? It's got all these causes of death. And so really, this is just there to get attention, right? It's there to make some potentially boring data more interesting. And so, a given organization might need some or even all of these types of dashboards. But the idea is essentially to try to create not kind of a single dashboard, which is often what we try and do. We try and create the one dashboard to rule them all, and to realize that that is futile, right? There's no way, like even if you wanted to create a dashboard for like even a fairly junior person, like a team lead or something in the organization, if you wanted to put all the data that they would potentially need on a single dashboard, it would literally be the size of a football field, right? It's not going to happen. We need to break things apart and have what I call an ecosystem of dashboards where it operates much, like I said, much more like a website than than a kind of a traditional dashboard. To me, trying to put all the information into a single dashboard is like trying to put all the information on a website onto a single page, right? You could do it, it's just not going to be usable. And that's unfortunately what a lot of dashboards are. So like I said, I've given you kind of the whirlwind tour. Obviously, there's a lot more detail that goes into this. If this happens to be of interest to you, if you're interested in taking the 2-day practical dashboards course, I offer this in a couple of different formats. I do 2 or 3 public workshops a year. The last one was in person in the UK a few weeks ago, but the next one's actually going to be online. It's in February, and where I teach both my practical charts course, which is data viz fundamentals, and the practical dashboards course. And I also, most of my workshops are private. And so if this is something that you think, would be of interest to your team of 15 to 60 employees, I do those both in person. I've traveled now to 16 countries, I think, or on Zoom. And so if that's of interest, that's my website, my contact information. Do feel free to connect with me on any of these platforms, and happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick. Just we really appreciate that. I didn't realize there was 9 whole types. I was like, oh, 9 types of dashboards. I don't know how are we going to get through all of those. But you know what? Working at an IT in an IT shop, you can see every single one of those somewhere. So appreciate that. And yeah, we'll just take 10 minutes for questions here. So you can send them over in the chat, or additionally, if you need to, just raise your hand and you can and ask the question to Nick. I noticed that there are just a few questions in the chat. So just to start off with, there is one here so Nick, when you showed off that picture of all of your connected web of data and or of dashboards, Hyan had the question, so as they are connected, do you start from roles to entities or from the bottom up? And by that, they mean the design before there's any data.
Yeah. Typically, yeah, you'll start with some entity dashboards. You don't have to, though. Like, it's one of the nice things about this approach is that it's kind of like saying, well, if you're creating a website, what page do you start with? So, well, actually, technically, you can start with any page, right? But most of the time, yeah, people will start with a few of the really kind of basically the entities that are of greatest interest: employees, customers, sales transactions, whatever those are. But you can be very demand driven too, which is kind of nice, right? Like if people are screaming for a marketing dashboard, well, then start with that, right? Or if people are screaming about or if whatever, I don't know, the chief operating officer has been complaining for months that they want a dashboard, well, then maybe start with a role dashboard for the COO.
So I had another question to get messaged to me, just asking about like I think they saw your tactical dashboards, and the comment was, they look very busy. Are you sure that a CEO is going to understand that level of detail? And it was just kind of curious if you've had to deal with anything like that with, that sort of layout for a dashboard.
Yeah. So there is actually, I mean, you said there are 9 types of dashboards. I talked about 8 types of dashboards. And that's because I told you there were 9 because there's actually a 9th type that I'm working on, which I call a summary dashboard, which I'm actually going to add to the course. And that will kind of ease people into a dashboard like this. It'll look much more like a kind of a traditional dashboard. You'll have, maybe sort of 4, 5, or 6 charts on it, the different types of charts. And so it'll provide kind of a gentle introduction to an area, a role, or an entity for people who are maybe less familiar with it. It would be quite limited though, because it's only going to show like I said, 4 or 5, maybe 6 charts, right? And that means that 95+% of the information that people might actually need to know is not going to be on that dashboard. And so it's designed to give people a kind of a very high level summary overview, a couple of, and you're going to make guesses about what metrics to actually include on that dashboard because there's always going to be tons of stuff which was probably going to be important at some point, which isn't going to make it onto that dashboard because with only 5 or 6 charts, how much can you show? And then once they're kind of familiar with that, which typically doesn't take very long, then you might show them something like this, like what I'm showing right now, saying, okay, so we've given you kind of the training wheels dashboard, so you're not too freaked out, and you can kind of get an idea of what's going on. But as we all kind of hopefully agree, there's tons of other things that you might need to pay attention to. And so now I'm going to show you this, right? It's like, yeah, there's a lot going on here, but that's because that's reality, right? There are, especially as a CEO, there are many, many things that you might need to respond to on any given day or week or month. And so, but the key thing here is these are called alert dots. And like I said, I mean, it would take me multiple hours to explain how these work, but from the user's perspective, it's real simple, right? Dark red is crisis, essentially. This means that, like, okay, you need to deal with this immediately. And then you have sort of, medium red and then light red. Light red is what I call actionably bad, which is essentially, it's not a crisis, but it's just bad enough that you're going to want to do something, right? You're going to want to investigate this, you're going to want to cancel a project or take some kind of specific action. And so with these action dots, even though there's a lot of information being shown here, it's actually very consumable because I know where to start, right? It gives me a sense of priority, right? If there's 3 dark red dots on a given day, I know exactly what I have to do first. I see somebody saying called a what dot. They're called alert dots. It's basically a technique that I developed, a number of years ago. I tried things like bullet graphs and others, but I just found that they were even much busier, in fact, than this. Because here we're showing a lot of metrics, right? We're showing what, 50 or something, and yet it's actually still kind of consumable. But with other techniques, bullet graphs or other chart types, it would be in fact much busier. The only other chart type that I'm showing here are spark lines, right? These little kind of mini line charts, just to give you an idea of trend. What led up to the current value. Has it been increasing recently, decreasing recently? But yeah, so there's actually, I mean, there's a lot of information on here, but that's kind of the point, is so that if something is going wrong anywhere within this user's scope of responsibility, they're going to see it immediately, right?
Mhm. Okay, thank you. There's another question here saying, what open source slash proprietary dashboard software do you recommend to make these kinds of charts?
Um, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I have to be actually kind of careful for a couple of reasons. The first is that I am an independent, right? I don't work for any of the big software companies. I speak at their conferences and, like I've done talks and videos and stuff for them, but they all have pretty serious limitations, in my opinion. They're none of them are particularly great. They have different sets of strengths and weaknesses, mostly weaknesses, in my opinion. And so actually a lot of my clients, what they've done is they've actually kind of done what I'm showing here as basically web pages that are generated by a little kind of homegrown, web application. Because as a web page, this is very simple, right? Very simple HTML, CSS, a little bit of JavaScript here and there. And so then you have total control, right? You can make this look however you want and behave however you want. You can have all the navigation that I showed, clicking on things brings you to other things. And it kind of makes sense that to implement something like this essentially as a web application, because that's kind of what I'm proposing. We start to think about dashboards as websites rather than as these kind of monolithic, standalone, single things. And so in terms of, I think the question of what open source proprietary dashboard software, the proprietary stuff, I think, is actually more limited than open source. And open source in this case would be whatever web application development stack you happen to use, or if you don't have any web application developers, they're super easy to find. They're literally the most common programming skills in the world. So, PHP, Java, whatever on the back end, and then real simple HTML, CSS on the front end.
So here's a flip question on you here, knowing that sometimes these proprietary softwares are better to get up and off the ground. If there
Yeah.
were one of them that you had to pick, low literacy, a lot of times we do work with nonprofits where they don't have a full data team. Like, what's your recommendation?
Like in terms of the
Well, like
dashboards that they would use,
let's
or in
say like
terms of,
a lot of the groups we work with don't have the funds to hire developers, and we maybe don't have the talent. So I'm just curious, like, is there a particular type of software that you think would be a particularly good fit for a nonprofit or somebody who doesn't have a full tech team?
well, I mean, that's kind of the irony though, because like the commercial products, first of all, they're expensive, right? And secondly, the expertise to use them is actually quite difficult to find, right? Like finding Power BI specialists or Tableau specialists is a lot harder than finding web application developers. And those specialists actually tend to be more expensive, right? They're more specialized. And so I would actually argue that it's kind of the opposite. It's actually cheaper to go this route. Now, what the commercial products do, as you kind of mentioned before, is they allow you to get up and running very quickly, right? You can actually have charts showing up on screens pretty fast. Whereas with, kind of a roll your own approach, it's going to take longer, right? It might be a week or 2 or 3 before you actually start seeing stuff on the screen. But then typically, in my experience, the project then actually accelerates. Whereas with commercial products, it tends to bog down because, after getting kind of the easy stuff done, right? You get some charts up on a screen, but then you want to have some, maybe some kind of, unique navigation or interactivity or something like that. And then, oh, well, the tool doesn't do that. And then you have to start fighting with it and hacking it. And then it just kind of bogs down essentially.
Okay,
Not
fair enough.
always, but yeah.
We've got another question here. Just what are some questions we should be asking to clients before we build a dashboard for them? Because I know it's a big question, but
Yeah, no, that's a
top three maybe.
very good question. I think, I mean, with especially with the kind of work that you guys would do, or I assume anyways, um, you might have to come up with the questions for them in a lot of cases, right? Which and there's nothing wrong with that, and at least to get the ball rolling so that they can kind of see what the possibilities are, right? But like I said, especially when you're not really sure what the question is, uh, assume that is everything okay, right? And that's almost always the first question you need to answer, and kind of the most important one. And so, kinds of questions that you can sort of ask to help you get a better understanding of what they think their definition of okay it actually is, or what is everything, are things like like, do you have any specific concerns at this point about the business or about the charity or the organization, or is there anything you're just worried about essentially? Do you have any aspirations? Like, are there things that you're hoping are going to happen, in the near future, in the distant future? What are the kinds of things that maybe have happened in the past, like problems that have happened in the past that you think maybe data would be useful in terms of at least anticipating those problems in the future, if not helping to maybe avoid or solve them? So basically focusing on essentially, what are their worries essentially, and then trying to see, okay, well, based on that, can we do something with this data to try to mitigate that, to try to make some of those problems or solve some of those problems, or at least predict them maybe, or identify them. But that's really the first step, I think, is figuring out, like, essentially, what are you worried about? Like, you're running out of money, or, is the demand for food from the food bank, exceeding supply, that kind of thing.
Cool. I really appreciate that. I think that's absolutely something you know what, I think we're running out of time here. So if you have other questions that you want to ask Nick, I think you can flash your contact information again on the screen for us, Nick. Let's give him another plug. And if
Sure.
you enjoyed the talk, and actually if you didn't, let's give him a nice warm round of applause there with the emojis, or note some thanks in the chat there. Um, but yeah, go check out Nick on his socials. Another plug just for Data for Good. We are taking a little bit of a holiday break, but we will be coming back with some updates on our LinkedIn, as well as through our email channels and through our meetup. Okay, folks? So appreciate you all coming out. Nick, once again, we greatly appreciate you coming out here. This was fantastic stuff. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the important work that you're doing.
All right. Have a good one, everyone. Happy
Thanks,
holidays.
Nick.
Take care.